The traditional views of focusing and depth of field, along with shutter speeds and apertures, have been more or less swept aside. A knowledge of them has been swept aside by camera computerization. When I used to teach photography, photographic holidays, 4-H holidays, I had a student who said to me, "Oh, don't worry, Derek. My camera does that all for me now." Well, I didn't argue with that person, but the next day I set up a scenario where a traditional knowledge of photography was essential in order to achieve the objective. And of course, the student couldn't do it. We see this when discussing depth of field, a topic closely associated with focusing. When photographers claim that micro four thirds cannot achieve differential focusing, that is, a sharp foreground against an out-of-focus background, I wonder if they understand that depth of field is created by aperture choice and focal length of lens. The numbers might be different, but the results look similar to what can be achieved by larger formats. Depth of field is the amount of image that remains sharp in front of the point of focus and behind. It varies according to aperture and lens choice, and for most shots it is what is known as 1/3 2/3 ratio. Therefore, if sharpness extends 5 feet in front of the subject or focusing point, then it extends 10 feet behind, a ratio that is constant for most shots regardless of aperture and lens. Here is a shallow depth of field created by a large aperture and a lens having a standard focal length. We shall see how this works later, but when automation does it all for the photographer, do we understand what is happening? In practice, a small aperture, f11, 16 or 22, depth of field gets progressively longer. At the other end of the scale, f5.6, 4 and 2.8, the opposite happens. It gets increasingly shorter. I cannot give exact amounts because a wide-angle lens, zoom or prime, increases depth of field at any aperture. A telephoto reduces depth of field at any aperture. Add to this the physical size of a sensor with their own variations, full frame, micro four thirds and smartphone, and unlike 35mm film, you have an impossible situation where depth of field amounts cannot be shown in a simple graph for everyone. Depth of field is significantly reduced for close-up photography, sometimes to just a few inches. Smaller sensors make it easier to get everything sharp, and a knowledge of traditional photography resolves many problems without focus stacking. Setting both aperture correctly and choosing the right lens have their parts to play, as well as sensor size. When photographing a shrub that fills the frame, focus in about 1/3 of the way into the shrub. This will maximize depth of field to ensure that the shrub is completely sharp and the background out of focus. And here we see the background going out of focus in stages. It should be noted that a smartphone, because of their small sensors, will render everything sharp simply by point and shoot. For landscapes and architecture, everything works the same regardless of sensor size, but photographic infinity kicks in at around 150 to 200 feet depending on the type of lens and aperture, important when maintaining sharpness in the foreground. Therefore, if the working aperture is f8, 11 or smaller, with a wide-angle optic, zoom or prime, the point of focus can be brought forward to around 50 feet, creating the hyperfocal distance, ensuring that both foreground and background are absolutely sharp. This is a technique easier to do with a prime lens than a zoom, because in addition to distance settings engraved around the barrel of the lens, so too is the depth of field scale. It is unlikely that if you look at your lens, most likely a zoom lens, then it is unlikely that a depth of field scale is going to be shown on that lens. However, in the days of prime lenses, when prime lenses were very much in the forefront of camera technique, then a depth of field was easier to print, to engrave a depth of field scale on the lens. I've got here a 17mm f1.8 prime lens, and you've got autofocus as normal, but if you move the ring back, there's a ring here, and I'll try and show a close-up picture of this in a moment, but if you move the ring back, then you go on to manual focusing. Some people do this by accident, incidentally, and wonder why the lens won't autofocus. And indeed, as you move this ring from front, which is where it is now, autofocus, to back, then you get manual focus. Not only that, you get the depth of field scale. And that's something I must confess to you I missed today when using a zoom lens. With prime lenses, when I used a Hasselblad camera, then the depth of field scale was engraved, and I knew, incidentally, exactly what I was doing, because I knew what would be sharp and what would be out of focus, courtesy of the depth of field scale. A huge benefit of Micro Four Thirds are interiors of churches and stately homes where you have to handhold in low light. Stabilization in Olympus and OM system cameras is excellent, but it is still likely that a wide aperture will have to be used, limiting depth of field. Micro Four Thirds give more depth of field than larger formats, even at f4, with the help of a wide-angle lens. In my film days, 35mm and medium format, I had to get permission to use a tripod, or, failing that, rest the camera on something like a font, which wasn't very satisfactory. On a photo shoot, every situation is different and dependent on what I wish to achieve, artistically or commercially, and both are very different.